Good afternoon. Today is Thursday. Today's Thursday, November 3rd, 2022, and I am Ebony Love. I'm located in Jacksonville, Florida, and I have the distinct honor of being joined by attorney Francis Johnson, who is located in Statesboro, Georgia. This interview is being taken place over Zoom, and without further ado, my first question for you, Attorney Johnson. Can you please state and spell your first name? Because I know, can you state and spell your first name and tell me where you were born?
Sure. Francis Johnson, Francys Johnson.
And where were you born?
Born in Augusta, Georgia.
Okay. What is your earliest memory?
My earliest memory. My earliest memory, I believe, was maybe a memory that was impressed to me from the stories that were told. But it is a story of my grandmother coming to Shreveport, Louisiana, where my mom and dad were raising us, and taking me back to Georgia. And I can remember her scooping me up off of my big wheel, and I asked if I could bring my big wheel, and she put it in the vehicle as well, her and my grandfather, and brought me back to the farm in Scriven County, where I remained. And I grew up on that farm with them, and I think I remember that so well because of their role in raising me and ultimately instilling values that have served the rest of my life. So I'm not sure if I remember that or just them telling me that story over and over again and me pleading my case, take the big wheel, was something that I actually remember happening that way, or if it's just a part of our personal myth making about how we came to be who we are.
Did you have a very close family unit?
I had a very close family, but it was a collection of cousins who were also being raised by my grandparents, as well as a close relationship with my two sisters who were nearest to me, and then some extended family to include my mom and my father and uncles and aunts who all sort of orbited around my grandmother and grandfather as the matriarch and patriarchs of our family.
And what were your grandparents' names?
My grandmother was Louise Riley Taylor, and she passed away my third year of law school, so didn't get to see me graduate. But she is the person who's mostly responsible for my love of the law, as well as my sense of justice. And then Eugene Talmadge Taylor, who's literally named for a segregationalist here in Georgia, and whose life beyond his namesake exemplified everything that there was to defy that system of segregation in every way that he could, with what tools he had as a landowning Black man who was trying to farm in the South in an environment where there was just systemic resistance to that kind of free man, if you will. He is a big part of the resistance that I connect to my Blackness and my manhood. And so Eugene and Louise Taylor.
Thank you for that. So you kind of just mentioned your roots, Scriven, Georgia. Can you tell me where exactly is that? That's in southeast Georgia? It's
Southeast Georgia, right on the border, Savannah River. So just about an hour from Augusta and an hour from Savannah on the Ogeechee, on the Savannah River on one side and the Ogeechee River on the other side. So Scriven County is a unique place. My grandfather ultimately got to Scriven County. He was assigned by Bishop Morris Brown, the second bishop of the AME Church, on the eve of the funeral of Richard Allen. He left Philadelphia and came to Scriven to set up AME churches. His name was the Reverend Robert Brady. That was my grandfather's grandfather, who was commissioned to set up churches in rural Georgia, between South Carolina and Georgia, and he did so on those plantations there. And so that's that legacy of the resistance that was the AME Church, and the use of the church as a tool of liberation that still sort of runs right into what I do now as a pastor and lawyer.
And so just side venture, you said your grandfather's grandfather was appointed by Morris Brown to help kind of bring the AME Church down into the South, especially
Sure.
Georgia. Does that have any relation to the Morris Brown, the school institution? Was it named after him? Okay.
Sure. So Morris Brown is an AME affiliated college whose motto is a haven for every hungry soul, and it is the oldest HBCU in the state, founded by Black people for Black people, and one of the few in the nation that has that kind of legacy, and named for a Black man, Bishop Morris Brown, the second bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
And it's kind of interesting that we're having this conversation because I'm in Jacksonville, Florida right now. And I've been doing research about the Black lawyers who were down here, people like James Weldon Johnson, Samuel Decatur McGill. And so before Bethune-Cookman became Bethune-Cookman, we also have Edward Waters, now University.
Mhm.
And my understanding was that those three schools were actually supposed to join into one, or do you know anything about how those schools are connected? If not, it's okay.
No, I really appreciate the question. I'm really proud of Edward Waters, Florida's oldest HBCU. The president, A. Zachary Faison, and I were in law school together at UGA, and we both shared our love for education, and so I very much saw a college president in his future, and so it's good to see the good work that he's doing, him and First Lady Faison there in Jacksonville. But the connection between the work of James Weldon Johnson, who leaves Florida, leaves Jacksonville, and comes to Savannah, and literally helps charter the first branch of the NAACP in Savannah. As a former state president, I can tell you that there is a long history that runs between the Georgia and Florida connection, and that history crosses civil rights organizations and educational institutions. And so I know about that legacy between Edward Waters and the Morris Brown Institution. Both of them are constituents of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and so they have that affiliation.
Thank you so much for that, and I'm sorry for going on.
No, that's fine. More than fine.
Okay, so I'm going to try to bring it back to you. And so you mentioned earlier, you were talking about the legacy of Scriven County and kind of how you were growing up down Southeast Georgia.
Mhm.
Can you tell me about your K through 12 experience? Did you go to segregated schools? Was it segregated because there was a majority Black population, or was it still, the ways of the time, the ways of the world? Can you tell me about your educational experiences, the people that you were surrounded by, and kind of how you made it through the K through 12 system?
Sure. So, I came around in the wake of the effort to desegregate schools in Scriven County. And for a large part, what that meant was, at the time I was going to school, most of the former Black schools had been shuttered, and most of the teachers had retired, and most of the principals had worked their way towards retirement as well, those former administrators. And so we were really left with schools that had no real interest in serving Black people, At the same time, new systems of oppression were being erected. And so if you can't segregate students, then naturally what develops, if those old lines of oppression are not disrupted, is a new system of segregating students. And so I was unfortunately a part of a system of tracking that tracked lots of Black and brown students into special education. So I spent my first few years um, um, in special education. And it took a collective lawsuit, a class action lawsuit brought by Georgia Legal Services and others, including the NAACP, to get that system of tracking fundamentally changed in Georgia. And of course, I went from one end of the special ed hall to the other end, to the gifted class. And I can remember having very thoughtful teachers, and I can remember having despicable ones, some who nourished my highest ambitions, and some who told me, and I remember this, that I would be dead or in jail by the time I was 18. And so it's a mixed bag. I am grateful that that I had teachers who ultimately um, uh, helped me to see the world very pragmatically, and with a realist lens, that that ultimately what I did with myself was up to me. And so I think they took bets on whether I could actually make it in the gifted class. And I think each year some of them lost those bets because I did just fine. At the same time, I had a small but core group of teachers who were telling me that it was bigger than me. I remember one teacher telling me once that I was a victim of circumstance. And that's something to tell a second grader, that they're a victim of circumstance. And I had some teachers who continually told me how proud I was, and how proud they were of me and my work. And so this is as a fourth, fifth, and sixth grader. And so ultimately, I've gone back to Scriven County many a time to speak to students still in that school system, to encourage teachers, and to let them know they can get anywhere if they put their heart and mind behind it.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned that there was a class action lawsuit
Sure.
about tracking, and two questions. Were you in any way, whether you or your family on behalf of you, involved in that litigation? Like,
Yeah.
were you named?
Yes, I had to testify. I can remember doing so. My parents had to meet with lawyers from the NAACP. And I can remember the community effort behind it. It was a really, really big deal.
Do you, by any chance, either remember the name of the lawsuit or what court it was filed in, federal or state?
So there was two parts to it. I believe it was a federal litigation and filed in the Southern District of Georgia. And then I think there were a few companion state-based cases and administrative cases dealing with the Department of Education as well.
Thank you. And you said that you were taken out of special ed classes and put it into gifted. What grade was that?
If I can remember correctly, I think it was around third grade.
Okay. And what year were you born?
Born in 1979. I'm just teasing. Of course, I remember that.
Yeah, it's the Spitfire questioning that we're all used to. Okay, so we're going to go towards the end of your high school career. Do you remember, or it might not even be towards the end of your high school career, do you remember when you knew that you wanted to go to college and kind of how that process evolved? I know you said earlier that your grandmother really instilled in you a love of education. Did she talk to you about that in high school, or was it kind of something that's always been there?
I think it was always something that's been there, an expectation that I would go to college. And I think uh, my earliest thoughts as to what I might do really came out of watching those lawyers move in that litigation. The only people I had saw who had that kind of respect were funeral directors and school teachers, and I didn't think I wanted to be a school teacher or a funeral director. And so those were the classes of professionals that I came into contact with in Scriven County. And of course, teachers were afforded the highest status among any of us because we all understood that education was the strongest rung on the ladder of mobility. And so, but when I saw those lawyers, those Black lawyers move and how they understood the system and how they explained it to all of us and how they could command the system to produce documents and people to be compelled to answer under oath. And I could see also something that I hadn't always understood, but I understood it instinctively when I saw it. I saw real fear on the faces of white folks who I thought had all the power. Um, and and I could see very well that they thought the system that they were firmly in charge of was slipping away from them, and they were powerless to stop that in the face of people who were going to hold them to account for their wrong. And so um, that was powerful for me, and I knew that I wanted to be connected to that. Well, there was a third class of professionals that I saw often besides the school teachers and the funeral directors, and that was the preacher.
Mhm.
That was the preacher. Um, but because I had so many preachers in my family, I didn't necessarily want to be a preacher. Um, and my grandfather didn't think much of the preachers that were around our area. Mostly they talked about heaven, um, and mostly they talked about how good our life would be after it was over. He had no interest in that at all. That kind of religion, if you can call it that. But he was deeply moved, always by uh, a self-efficacy and determination to make out of this world what it ought to be for all of us. And I think my resistance to wanting to be a preacher was because my grandfather just had such little respect for them and their sort of waiting for the hereafter for anything to change. And then a pastor by the name of Eddie Lee Jenkins became the pastor of my local church, and he had um, he had studied under Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. He had read, he was well read, and he preached not about the hereafter. As a matter of fact, he rarely preached about heaven at all. He preached about how we may make this world more like heaven, and how we might be God's children, accepting nothing less than what was our birthright, which was abundant living. And so I was um, totally moved by Reverend Jenkins, and was trying to figure out how I could be both a lawyer and a preacher, which my grandmother thought was incompatible. And and maybe I'm still on that quest to try to make those two things work together.
You said Reverend Jenkins. Is it Eddie Eddie?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so you ended up going to college.
Sure.
Um, I You went to Georgia Southern.
I did.
Um, what did you study when you first got there? Were you still struggling between, law school and the ministry, or how did you figure out what you wanted to study and what did you end up studying?
Well, I studied political science and Africana studies, and I wanted to know more about the system because I had in my mind to learn as much about it so that I could be a part of its deconstruction. And I wanted to know more about who I was because I knew that what I had been told was insufficient across the board. That our history did not begin in slavery. That we were a people before that. I can remember a salesperson coming around to our our farm, and he was a Bible salesperson. He had this big white leather bound Bible, and in it contained these illustrations, he said, of all the people in the Bible who were Black. And there were maybe a dozen pictures of folks who could be people of color, including one that he emphasized the most, and that was the person who carried the cross for Jesus of Nazareth. And I can remember thinking to myself as he was making this pitch, here is the Black man who carried the cross for Jesus. And I can remember saying to him, but wasn't Jesus of Nazareth also a person of color? And I can remember him looking at me and then looking at the white Jesus that we had on our wall in our home and pointing to that white Jesus and saying, you can see for yourself that Jesus is white. I can remember that cognitive dissonance as if it was just yesterday. And I needed to reconcile how the whole book of the Bible largely takes place in Africa, northern Africa, northwestern Africa, in a place we now call the Middle East, or some people call the Middle East. And how is it that this story, which originates in Africa, could be told in such a way that you get from Acts 10:34, which is God is no respecter of persons, till you get to the church getting in the business of crowning people based on a divine right of blood. That God did make some to be kings and some to be subjects. How do you get from there to hereditary slavery if God is no respecter of persons? Either this book is a lie, or what people have said about it is a lie. And so I needed to resolve those things, and there it is.
So in trying to resolve those, kind of that dissonance that you're talking about,
Mhm.
you study political science, you study Africana studies. Did you immediately go into law school, or did you try to go into the ministry? Like, how did that process happen?
So I'd already been a very engaged student lay leader within our church, and I participated in activities like Y Club and done all of those kinds of things. When I got to college, I was intrigued with college ministry and started very much doing that through the Baptist Student Union and other groups, and really was struggling with the fact that there was not um, a connected ministry to Georgia Southern that spoke to the issues of Black people outside of the very westernized theology that had already begun coming out of. And that's when I discovered the writings of James Cone, who was at Union Theological Seminary. And I discovered the writing of Dolores Williams and Renita Weems, and I can go on and on and on about the theologians who were writing about liberation. And so I can remember deciding to teach a Bible study and start a prayer group at school based on that, and then formally sought a process of ordination through my church, which was then a member of the National Baptist Convention. And so I started that process. And while I was at Georgia Southern, I was licensed and then eventually ordained into the ministry and started serving a local church in Statesboro that was located right across from the college, Second St. John Baptist Church. And there they had a very encouraging minister by the name of Reverend Craig R. Trimble, who encouraged my development. He himself was a young minister when he started. He encouraged my development, and I went from Georgia Southern directly to the University of Georgia Law School, and continued my educational pursuits there.
Did you continue preaching when you were in law school?
I did. I preached nearly every Sunday. I joined the Ebenezer Baptist Church West under the leadership of Reverend Dr. Winfred Hope, and he and his wife Betty Hope who was a teacher as well, encouraged my development. While I was there in Athens, I was called to a church in Southeast Georgia in Pembroke. Um, and I served them and continue to serve them to this very day um, as a minister. And ultimately, when I finished law school and came back to Statesboro, I continued preaching and pastoring now. So,
Okay. We're gonna like kind of pivot again and talk about your law school experience a little bit more in depth. Um, why did you choose the University of Georgia Law School?
it was the best program available to me, and I knew that I wanted to do my work in Georgia, and um, and of the folks I could ask, most of them wanted to go to Georgia and couldn't go, and all of them thought that I had no chance in going, and getting in and going. And so to be from Georgia and go to the flagship university made a lot of sense. They offered me the financial resources to be able to do it, and so it was. I applied to several schools. I didn't get a rejection from any school. I just simply knew that I would do the majority of my work here in Georgia, and thought that a degree from the University of Georgia would give me the best platform in which to do that work.
So, do you remember what year you started law school?
I do.
What's the
2001.
okay? So, the school generally was desegregated 1961. Do you? I can probably find this out. Like when the actual first Black student came to the law school,
Yes.
but
The first Black law student was Chester Davenport.
that's his name. I was like, I know the name, can't remember it. Chester Davenport.
I got a chance to meet and to know while I was there, and of course, the second Black graduate was Justice Robert Benham, who served as Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, and who I've gotten to know closely and count as a mentor.
So, how was your experience as a Black law student at University of Georgia?
I had a terrific experience. I can remember going to law school in the context of the fierce debate over affirmative action. At that time, the Supreme Court was wrestling with two very important cases dealing with the role of affirmative action in undergrad education as well as graduate education. And it was very much a part of my consciousness, the notion of whose seat the very limited seats in the law school belonged to. And so on one side, folks were saying we were taking seats from qualified white students. That's only if you begin with the premise that they have some right to those seats in the first place. And so this was the emergence of a stronger Black consciousness in me that I fully was convinced needed to form any analysis of the law as I moved forward. And so I can remember the law school being very open under Dean Shipley, David Shipley, who's still there, and then Dean Rebecca White. I can remember going to the law school and there being only one African American on faculty. And then during my 3 years in law school, the school taking aggressive steps to recruit others. And I can just remember proposing solutions to problems. We had a broad experience that was in Brussels, and a broad experience that were in other sort of European places. We wanted a broad experience in Africa, and so we set up an exchange program with the Ghanaian Supreme Court. And I can remember asking for that, for additional funding for our BOSSA program. We had a person who was involved on a national level, who was 1 year ahead of me, Aretha Blake, who's now a judge in Charlotte, North Carolina. she encouraged me to get involved in leadership, and I did. And our law school supported that effort. It supported our efforts to expand our moot court mock trial programs. Uh, at that time, I think we had the right leadership at the university level. Additionally, we had a provost who's now president, Jerry Moorhead, who was a lawyer by training, went to the law school, and I think he could clearly see the path and higher education was leading towards greater inclusion and diversity and equity. And I think there was not a thing we asked for that we didn't receive. At the same time, when I think back on it, I know the law school because I serve on the Alumni Association board and have served for many years now. Is a different place. When I walked in the door, there were portraits of old white men lining the halls. It was a place that was unwelcoming, at least just, it suggested that we didn't have a place here. Just a few days ago, I went to the law school to talk with young 1 and 2 Ls, and there the rotunda when you walk in to Hirsch Hall is now named the Chester Davenport Rotunda for the first Black student. And then Robert Benham's portrait is hanging on the wall in there, along with Judith House, who's the first white female student to graduate. And then you walk into the Sharon Neota Tucker admission suite. Sharon Neota Tucker was the first African-American female to graduate from the law school. I believe she graduated in 1974. I think Chester Davenport graduated in 1968. And I think Robert Benham graduated in 1970, if I'm correct. And so, while Robert Benham and Chester Davenport and Neota Tucker are making their way through law school and getting into their practices, I'm just a young student trying to escape special ed. And to think that I would later go back to that, go to their school, our school, and continue their legacy is very, very proud tradition. When we were at the law school, we renamed our Boston chapter for Chester Davenport and Justice Robert Benham. It's the Davenport Benham chapter of Boston. We took that very seriously. So I cannot tell you how enriching the experience was going to the University of Georgia and joining that legacy with all of its contradictions. And I am an active alumni to this very day. And we give regularly to the support of the university because we can see how those dollars track back. One example of this is one of our students here who worked in our law office as a legal assistant, preparing to go off to law school and had a choice to go to the University of Florida, who was offering a more generous scholarship package, and the University of Georgia. I was convinced we didn't need to send that young student to Florida, for God's sake. Sort of reckless abandon to let her go to the University of Florida. So she goes to the University of Georgia, and at the same time, the law school creates the Robbie Robinson Scholarship, named in honor of an NAACP lawyer, Robbie Robinson, who was killed in a mail bomb in 1986, I believe, that was sent to his office in Savannah. He was an alderman and an NAACP lawyer in Savannah in 1986. In 1986, I want you to think about that. And so while I'm making my way out of special ed, and through the help of Black lawyers, and Justice Benham and Sharon Neota Tucker and Chester Davenport are making their way into the practice of law, you got Robbie Robinson, who graduates from the law school as well, who's back practicing in Savannah and is killed. And to know that later, as a part of the Alumni Association, we would approve funding for that, and ultimately a student who worked in my own law office would receive that. Every day, I can pinch myself and thank God that I'm living in a time and period where I can see the seeds bloom and blossom from all that that they planted, those who came before us, and the benefits are redounding to future generations of lawyers. And hopefully, someone one day will rise up and bless my name for planting seeds of my own. And so, that's what it's all about. But I had a terrific experience. I did everything that I wanted to do. I did some things I probably shouldn't have done, but I had a very rewarding experience, very enriching classmates who I still contact and see often. Um, and so that's a very bright spot.
Just digging a little bit deeper. So I'm doing this interview as a way to kind of capture the history of the Southern region of the National Black Law Schools Association. Earlier, you mentioned Aretha Blake was at your University of Georgia Law School, and she was involved in the national leadership. So were you ever involved in the national leadership or the regional leadership, and what position did you hold?
Yes, I was very involved. I served as the Southeast Regional Director, and then I served as I want to say I served as a national parliamentarian. I ran for national chair as well, and lost in a runoff to Mashonda Baldwin, who was out of Maryland, I think the University of Maryland, and continued to be involved in Boston for a few years, coming back to judge the mock trial and moot court competitions. And so, yeah, but yes, Aretha Blake was involved at the regional leadership level and encouraged me to be involved. And it was a terrific experience, a terrific experience.
When when were you involved in this? You said Southeast Regional Director. Was that as a 1L or a 2L?
As a 2L, I think it was 2002 and then 2003.
And then were you the national parliamentarian at the same time, or did that come after?
I was the national parliamentarian and also the regional director.
Okay.
Mhm.
Do you know who was the you said Southeast Regional Chair?
Yes,
Who was the chair before you? Or director, sorry.
I cannot recall.
Do you know who came after you?
Yes. Joyce Neal came after me. Joyce is a attorney in Atlanta, still practicing. And she's actually, Joyce now sits as a judge as well in Atlanta. And so Joyce Neal came after me. She was an outstanding student there at Emory University.
And my last question on this. So I served as the 50th Southern Regional Chair, and I know that there was a reorganization. I'm not even going to lie and say exactly when. I know the dates. I'll supplement the record later. But you said Southeastern region. Were you involved with, trying to connect with other regional directors or with the national organization to kind of like centralize everybody into like one kind of organization?
So yes, we were all convinced, because legal education was in such a focus, that we needed to take a different tone and adopt different tactics. We filed an amicus to the Supreme Court case involving university admissions into law school, and so
Was that Baki by any chance?
yes,
Okay.
yes. There was a companion case that was out of the University of Georgia as well, so it hit very close to home.
Mhm.
There was a case that originated out of the University of Georgia. So yeah, we understood that a lot of our issues were collective issues that we were experiencing all over the country. We'd also seen the decline of African Americans seeking legal education. And the pipeline that people kept talking about, we just understood was never going to materialize. We also had deep concerns, abiding concerns that, again, as barriers are lowered in one area, that new barriers are erected. And so the notion of Black lawyer disbarment was something that that we needed to address and be concerned with. And and ultimately a pathway to not just join the status quo, but a pathway to change the practice of law to reflect a more just and equitable society. And so there were lots of us who I'm sure the university had to make adjustments because of our presence. We were not just there to be well-trained lawyers to serve the interest of the status quo.
I have two more questions, and I promise we're done. The first question is kind of short. Do you happen to remember any of the names of the lawyers who were working on that tracking case? You said that you were inspired by some of them. Do you remember their names?
Yeah, so I know that James Bass, who recently retired as a Superior Court judge in Savannah, was involved. And that's all I can remember.
Okay, and so now my last question is going to kind of bring this all for full circle. So
and I think the case was in front of Judge Avant Edenfield.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Judge Avant Edenfield.
Can you spell that?
Avant, Avant, Edenfield.
Okay.
Edenfield.
Okay. Thank you. So my last question, bringing it all full circle. We started by talking about how you grew up in Scriven County, how you started your educational system kind of embroiled in this lawsuit to get you into, equitable schooling. And it was led by the Georgia NAACP. Mm-hmm. You were the president of the Georgia NAACP. You mentioned it a little bit earlier in the conversation. And so bringing this all full circle, what was your goal as president of the Georgia NAACP? And do you feel as if you were able to meet and achieve that goal while you were president?
So we clearly understood that our problems that we were having, I'd served some time after law school as the Southeast Regional Director. And I may have got my nomenclature mixed up with BOSA and the NAACP, but the Southeast region of the NAACP is made up of Georgia, Florida, Alabama, South and North Carolina, Mississippi, Tennessee, those 7 states of the South. And so at one point I was the chief manager of the NAACP's work in those states and was a member of the national staff. It was after that tenure that I ran to become state president of the Georgia NAACP, which is the state's oldest and largest civil rights organization. And we very much understood that a new civil rights coalition had to be built. And not only that, but a new and more broader movement towards greater human rights had to be launched. And the old compromises of the civil rights movement that really crystallized in the 50s, 60s, those promises, those compromises were failing to deliver the kind of meaningful change that we needed to see deep and wide across communities. And so we needed to stand up a new movement. We had a few ideas about how to support younger voices. And I'm very happy that all of the protesters eventually across the movement known as Black Lives Matter would eventually be supported by the NAACP through a bail fund. We also wanted to have a robust response to the challenges to the vote, the franchise. I mean, it is cumulative and preservative of all other rights, that it is the right to vote. And So we wanted to have a litigation first strategy when it came to that, and sue the state, Brian Kemp as Secretary of State, and others um, over voter suppression issues. Um, and in those lawsuits, we prevailed on 10 out of 12 of them. And then the last thing that we really wanted to do was to energize the network of branches, which were the strength of the NAACP. And so the work of a lot of civil rights organizations was celebrity driven, personality focused on who was the leader. But our branch model within the NAACP was that ordinary people working in their own sphere of influence could bring about tremendous change when you put them together. And so um, that's why I always say that you know, people may not know who the local president of the NAACP is. They may not even know who the national president is, but they do know that what the NAACP stands for, and those letters are most important. So Black Lives Matter, when they came about with a decentralized structure like that, it felt very akin to the NAACP. And so we wanted to energize those branches. We started more branches than had been started by any other state president. More college and youth chapters were reactivated than anyone else in the modern era. And so very, very, very proud of that. The lawsuits, the new wave of student and adult activists, and then adopting a very strong tactical posture of civil disobedience again. When we launched Moral Monday, which was a part of the Moral Monday movement that William Barber, who was NAACP state president in North Carolina, launched, we were decided that we were going to start to raise the tenor of our the debate and engage in a different set of tactics beyond just walking into business meetings and walking out with little. And so getting arrested, taking an arrest, for example, with Reverend Raphael Warnock over Medicaid expansion was important and good work. And it was important that the NAACP president be a part of this new wave of civil disobedience. And so ultimately, you know, I think those things were important, especially as we've seen, you know, how that Black Lives Matter movement would play out. I was president when Trayvon Martin was killed in Sanford, Florida. And during my tenure, we had to develop a response to these extrajudicial killings that were taking place at a clip of one killing per day. In some places that were people that were Black people, and 3 killings per day when you count all people. The NAACP was founded in 1909. At the time of its founding, there was nearly a Black man lynched every day. Now there are nearly 3 people who are being killed by the police every day. And it's an untenable situation, and one that we couldn't allow to continue.
Thank you so much for your story. I quite literally could talk to you for another hour, respectful of your time. I might actually reach out for a second interview because I know that there were a lot of things I wanted to talk about. For example, your involvement with like the New Georgia Project, but again, keeping this focused. And thank you so much again for sharing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Glad to be involved. Thank you again. Take care.